Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy. I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversations with other writers. Thomas Ensor is an aspiring writer from Lexington, Kentucky. He was born and raised in the bluegrass and loves to explore the outdoors, whether that be parks, the Arboretum, or the Red River Gorge. He graduated from the University of Kentucky with a Bachelor's of Science in English and a minor in computer science. He now works for a local marketing company where he gets to explore different styles of writing. His passion is for science fiction and fantasy, where he aims to combine his scientific interest with creative writing to create grounded yet fanciful fiction for detail-oriented audiences. And this is my conversation with Thomas.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there.
It's nice to meet you. Finally meet you face to face.
You too. So what are you working on now, and what motivated the projects?
So right now, I'm working on a couple. I'm working on like two different things, though it's two categories of things, and so I'm working on kind of like a sci-fi universe and like a fantasy universe. But it's not so much like a definite here's a plan for this universe, here's a plan for this. It's more so kind of takes the shape of a bunch of little short stories that I write, because I write as I get ideas. And so I kind of flip back and forth between sci-fi and fantasy as I get bored of one or the other. But generally right now I'm kind of working on just a bunch of different little short stories. I kind of have a hard time. I have a problem where I don't finish them a lot because I'll get bored and move on. But that's something I've been working on, is finishing my stuff. But mostly it's just a lot of little short stories for these kind of universes that I'm building. One's like a sci-fi, like biopunk kind of universe thing, and the other is just like a generic like fantasy magic hero's journey vibe. But I'm working on kind of developing the whole world around the hero's journey and not just this one story. But what motivated these projects is just general inspiration. Whenever I read somebody else or like play video games and stuff, I just get ideas for stories. I'm like, oh, like wouldn't this be cool? Like wouldn't that be neat? But also kind of by just everything I interact with. The more I read, I'm just like, oh, that'd be a cool idea, and so I'll bring that in. Or if I'm playing like a video game with my friends and something weird happens, I'm like, oh, that'd be like a cool story. Like some of my stories are honestly just kind of pulled from like my D&D event, my Dungeons and Dragons adventures with some of my friends, because sometimes we do some things that I'm just like, this is a story. This is literally ludicrous and funny, so I'm gonna write this. But generally it's just motivated by just the things I like, the things I consume. There's not some sort of like burning like I gotta write this like super good story for some specific reason, at least not yet. I'm more so kind of just developing these different worlds as I am interested in them.
I think that's so cool. So a lot of your inspiration is coming from your everyday life, including things like other creative activities that you participate in things like D&D and stuff like that. I think that's a really cool idea, pulling from those exterior games or sources that influence you or that inspire you and just recording those on paper. That's so great.
Yeah, well, because it's like, some of these games are experiences and stories in their own right, and so it inspires me to think sometimes, because like sometimes I think people like think like video games, like the other things that we do, are just like benign and not interesting, and I'm like, I mean, sure, to an extent they may not be the most interesting, but that doesn't mean they have to stay that way.
What have you learned about yourself through writing?
I have learned that can be way too detail oriented and way too worried about things being correct. Because especially since a lot of my writing is like, and also influenced by like my love of like science and things, and it's like, oh, it's like, what if like things were different? What if science worked differently? And so then I'll just be like, well, what does that really mean? And then just like all of a sudden be like reading about just like really complicated scientific processes, and I'm just like, Thomas, you cannot like reinvent everything. You kind of have to just like, it's science fiction for a reason, or it's fantasy for a reason. You don't have to like, you can just make up a magical plant that does things. You don't have to like explain it. And so, and now to be fair, I do think sometimes I really do enjoy explaining really complicated things, or kind of like through a story, kind of working with really complicated things and stuff. But I will get caught up in the details and be so concerned that like, I want people to understand like everything. I want them to get exactly what I'm saying. And that kind of goes to the rest of my life too, where I find that like I will sometimes with my friends, I will like talk way too much, or just like be so worried about like saying the wrong thing, and they're just like, you can calm down, we're your friends, we're not gonna just like attack you because you like said something that we thought was stupid, or I don't know. But I get caught up in details, I get caught up in the little things, and so I've learned that like, hey, sometimes that's good, but sometimes you need to stop that, because it is not leading you anywhere and you're just wasting energy and time.
How does your interest in scholarly and scientific writing inform your approach to creative writing?
So kind of going back to what I said about my inspiration from science, and so one thing like just as I'm inspired by like video games and like other things, I'm also inspired by just like it may sound strange, like I don't know, like reading textbooks or just like reading articles that I'm interested in, because I'm very much interested in just like like biochemistry, like mycology, like the little science. So like it's like here's like this like organism that's doing these like complicated things on the inside that you don't even see, and so I just like kind of want to delve into that like mystery and like kind of break it apart. And so my interest in like scholarly and scientific writing, for my fiction at least, is like very much motivated by this sense of like exploration and then also explanation through story, to where it's like people can often be like, oh my gosh, like this topic is like so weird or like confusing, I don't get it. And there's plenty of things like outside of science that in writing, the stories help people convey very complex things in simpler ways that people can understand. And so for me, that kind of falls into science, where it's like there may be something like I'm really into like mycology, like mushrooms and stuff. And so a lot of my writing, I'll try and like make these like really weird like fungus plants that do like no, they're not plants, but these really fungi that do like strange things and stuff. And it's like it's because it's like, guess what? In the real world, that happens too. It's just you can't see it as well. And so it's like that sense of like exploration is one thing I really enjoy when I'm writing fiction, but also with my scholarly writing, which I've not done as much since I've graduated college, but I would like to get back to it at some point. Is it's kind of the same idea where it's like I'm passionate about things and I want people to understand and like to maybe at least like see why I'm so passionate about it and see why it's so cool. And so for my scholarly writing, it's more so just like explaining in a way that people can understand, because oftentimes I with some of the things I've read or people I've talked to, it can be very obtuse, and if you don't know the lingo and the jargon, it's like very very hard to get into it. And so I kind of want to break some of those barriers down and just like explain things in a way that like people who may not ordinarily be interested can understand and be like, oh wait, that's kind of cool, I may like that.
What's the role or responsibility of writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why write?
Because I want to share. It's very much like I want to share. Like there's things I keep finding every day that I'm like this is super cool. Like oh my gosh, this is neat. Like very much like oh my gosh, shiny thing. Let me share shiny thing. But of course it gets more complicated than that, because it's like I'll be like walking outside or whatever, and I'll like see a mushroom like growing out of like some mulch and stuff, and I'm like that's super cool. I'll like identify it, and then like I want to tell my friends where it's like, hey, like this cool mushroom I found, it does like these cool things, and like because there's all sorts of mushrooms that do all sorts of random things. Same with like plants and everything in science. There's so much like there's so many things that we don't see that happen, or so many complex interactions that we don't see. And the more and more that I learn about these complex things, the more and more I want to share them, because I just think they're so neat. And again, it's like through my writing, it's like I'm like there's not a lot of people, or it's not often where you get people who really want to like take the time to like really explain complicated things in a way that is easier to understand. And as somebody who, I mean, I frequently do it with my friends, where I will just like not have rants, but lectures. Sometimes I get called like a professor or whatever, but it's just because I'm passionate about the things I learn and I want to share it and like want people to also understand it. I don't want just to like talk at people and be like, I'm so smart, look at all the things I can say to you. It's like, no, what's the point of that? I'd rather you actually get it and like get excited with me.
When you're struggling to write for whatever reason, what do you do to help get yourself back to the page?
I tend to kind of go back to the things that like that really invigorate me and spark joy. And so that may be like if I'm like really struggling with like a certain thing, it's like, okay, what inspired this in the first place? Or maybe I'll just take a break altogether and like go out into nature. Though for me, nature isn't just like the woods or whatever. It's like nature is like like that patch of grass in front of this random place. Nature is as I'm walking through my neighborhood, it's like all the trees and the grass and stuff. Like I mean, even at like the office and stuff, there'll be times where I'm like looking through like I'll be the nerd who is like looking for like mushrooms in the mulch and stuff. And let me tell you, there's several. Um, but and so it's like and so it's like these everyday things that I do where it's like it's like take me back to the page. I tend to just kind of like slow down a bit and like go back to the things that inspired me in the first place. So it's like play some video games with some friends, read a book, or if there's like a certain like thing I'm writing that was inspired by a certain like moment in a certain book, I'll go back and read that again. Or if there's like a certain like scientific paper talking about something like that I found really interesting, I'll read it again and try and like figure out like like why did I think this was so cool in the first place. But I just try and go back to what inspires me, and just like try not to necessarily think about writing in that moment, but just kind of just like isolate and be like, why do I like this? Why do like what makes me write this in the first place? And like it's like that passion and that like wanting to understand.
I completely agree. Going back to reminding yourself the purpose of the piece that you're creating is really helpful, especially when you get lost in all the minutia and all the different angles you could take. Thinking about the purpose really helps us sort of ground that story and keep us focused and motivated to continue to do it. And then also it helps us navigate page length, right? Because attention is something that we are in short supply on when it comes to an audience. So really making sure that your message is clear within a reasonable word limit or page limit is critical. And
Mm-hmm.
I think creating that space where you're separating yourself from the piece for a little bit, kind of putting it down, and then going and doing something else so that you can come back fresh is also really helpful.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Because like you're talking about the page length and stuff. It's like, as I said, I'll get like lost in the details, and so I'll find myself like trying to like write this like a very specific thing or whatever, blah 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 blah. But then I go back out to it's like to what inspired me in the first place, and I'm like, this is much simpler than you think it is. You don't need to be like, I'll go and like look at the mushroom or whatever, and I'm just like, hey, like you don't have to like get so deep into it because it's like what you're getting at is already there. It's like to a lot of people, it's like they don't need a textbook in a fiction novel. That's not what they're here for.
What revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful when revising your own work and why? What problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
Well, first I will say revision is probably one of my weakest points. I tend because my issues I'll tend to just like discard things and start over, which is like at first is okay if I'm like like right like trying testing out new ideas, but there's honestly a lot of times where it's like I've had great ideas and I just need to rework it. And so that what I really try and do is just, well, one to, as I kind of mentioned, like take time away from it and come back to it. But also that one of the things I really try and do is just like as I said, just go back to what I liked before. And also I just try not to be so hard on myself, because it's like it's very much like if I'm reading something, I know what I'm looking for, but that is very much not what a reader is looking for or like somebody else is looking for. And so I very much try to kind of take like not like an alternate perspective, but just be like, stop, like don't put so much of like myself into it, and more so just kind of focus on like some more of just like the like not objective facts, but just like what are the good things about this, what do you not like, what do you like, and kind of try and move away, like move some of myself out of it so much that I'm not so just like, this sucks, this stinks, you're bad, because like that's not a great way of thinking about this. And if I could just get stuck in that loop, it's like, okay, well then you're of course you're gonna throw it all away if you think all of it's bad, but it's not bad. There are definitely some good parts that you do like and that are like objectively done well, and you should keep those. And so I just try and like sometimes take my massive self critic out of it and just be like a little more kinder to myself.
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful advice. I think a lot of writers are hypercritical of themselves. They are often their own worst critic. And so when you're able to go through and maybe start with something that says, okay, this is working really well, how can I build on that? That's a much more effective approach to revision.
Mhm. Well, it's also helped too because it's like I've started sharing more of my work with some of my friends, and because they've also shared their work with me in the sense where like, so I have friends who like they're like visual artists and digital artists, and so they'll send like a picture and be like, this sucks, I hate it, and I'm just like, no. Like I'm like, is it the best ever? Absolutely not, but I love it. It's a great image. I think you are a fantastic artist. And they're just like, well, what could I do better? And I'm like, let me think about it. And it's like, and like I don't necessarily like criticizing my friends' work. I'm not a visual artist, so I really don't know as much. But it's like there's like, give me your honest opinion. And so I kind of do the same. I'll try and do the same thing too, where it's just like, because again, I've said to them literally, you are your harshest critic. And so it's like a little like hypocritical of if I'm just like, oh, like I'm, and so I try to do the same thing, take the set where it's like, hey, maybe like you should, maybe like you are your own harshest critic as well.
What is your favorite part of the writing process and why?
It would definitely be planning and world building. Since the devil is in the details, when I avoid them, I have a great time. Uh, yeah, but so like I've always really enjoyed like kind of like sketching out like plots for stories or just like and it's like I'll kind of like make like the backbone and stuff. And then I love like putting like little like details and like little things in it where it's just like, oh, like then this is gonna happen, like then that's gonna happen, and so I don't have to like necessarily like focus on like the exact like execution in prose. I can just kind of be like, this cool thing will happen here after this cool thing happens. And so when it's that simple, I can just kind of put it down without having to be like, oh, but like, did you like handle that properly? Did you like write it well enough? And then world building too is something I really, really enjoy, just in the sense of like kind of like imagining like what if thing like just imagining things and like kind of like creating like I have like a world that like, I would like to be in, or a world that like is adapted for like different circumstances, or just like, just something different. I really enjoy kind of just exploring different things, different ideas, and just sketching out these like vast, large open areas that I can eventually fill up with detail. But and then I try and do that and it terrifies me and I get really scared. But it's still fun beforehand. And there's definitely times where like when I am like on like a roll and like very much like going like, like kind of like in the flow, in the zone, where like I can just like fill out like a vast amount of like things and be like, this is so cool. I'm very much enjoying it.
What reading suggestions do you have? What authors do you keep in your back pocket?
Well, first I will say I'm just now getting back into reading a lot more, because after my first, so I graduated like from college like in December, so like 6 months ago or something. And I was kind of burnt out from reading after that, because I read a lot of books in that time and I was very much tired of reading. And then but recently I've kind of gotten back into it, and of course I've read a lot of books in the past that I loved. So I will say like in the past and now, one author that I'm kind of like that I remember why I like them so much is definitely like he's a classic, Isaac Asimov. Just because I'm rereading the Foundation series, and because I read it for the first time in like middle school / high school, and reading it again now as like an adult, I definitely see a lot of the same things, but also see a lot more, and so it's really, really nice to see that kind of like evolution of myself, because it's like, the story hasn't changed, but I have, and so it's really cool to see that. And Isaac Asimov is just a classic sci-fi author in general. A lot of things that he's done, I think, when you read it, you're just like, this has been done before, blah 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 blah. But it's like, well, it's been done before because he did it first. Or not necessarily he did it first, but he was like a person who made it popular. Because that's one thing I've been kind of realizing, is like a lot of like things that like authors do nowadays was done by somebody like for the first time in the past. And so looking back, it may seem like, oh, this is like repetitive, or this is like redundant compared to nowadays. But it's like, I think recontextualizing it like with the time is really interesting. And then a more modern author I really, really enjoy for fantasy is Robert Jordan. I read all of the Wheel of Time series. It is my favorite. You can ask anybody at the office about it, and they will know, because I have I have the world map in my office. So it's my favorite fantasy series. I think because it is very complicated. There's just so much detail, and it's like, spans 14 books. So it's like it's like you can just very much sink into it, because it's nothing but detail all the time, essentially. And so I really, really, really love that. And then another author that I kind of really enjoy, though I've not read he's a little bit harder to read, is David Foster Wallace. He was definitely what I read more like I was like in college and stuff, just because his writing, I think, really challenged me. And at that time in my life, I was very much like looking to like get better at writing. And he was somebody, I think, who definitely challenged me reading wise, and made me think a lot differently and write a lot differently. And so he's, he, I don't know, he's some issues, but like it's every author, I guess. I don't know, but I enjoy it.
Awesome. I think that's a wonderful reading list. On there, we have challenging authors that are going to push us to go further. And then in that, we also have authors who write stories that we find very comforting. So it creates a kind of security and a reminder of why we really like the things that we like. So thank you so much for that reading list. And thank you so much for making time to hang out with me. I learned so much over our conversation, and I really appreciate it.
No, I had a great time. Thank you for having me as well. I appreciate it.